letter arrived after the season had already turned, after the first snow had sealed the mountain passes and made the town feel even smaller than it was. It sat for days on the narrow counter of the post office, its envelope creased and dulled by travel, its ink faint, as if the words themselves were unsure they belonged here. By the time it was finally sorted and carried out into the cold, it felt less like a message and more like an echo, something meant for an earlier moment that had already slipped away. The town lay in the northern reaches of Montana, folded into a basin of low hills and dark pine forests that seemed to swallow sound. Winter arrived early here and lingered without apology. Snow stayed long after it had melted elsewhere, clinging to rooftops and fence posts, as if reluctant to let go. The streets were quiet even at midday, their silence shaped by routine rather than peace. People lived close to the land and closer still to their habits, and anything new was noticed immediately. The woman arrived by train in the thin light of a late afternoon that felt closer to dusk. The station was little more than a wooden platform pressed hard by frost, its boards gray and splintered, its sign faded nearly beyond recognition. She stepped down with a single suitcase in her hand, her boots too clean for the mud packed along the tracks. The wind caught her coat and tugged at it sharply, as if testing her resolve. She stood still for a moment, adjusting to the cold, to the smell of resin and iron, to the sudden awareness of how far she had traveled to reach a place that did not seem to be waiting for her.
She had come on contract, a position promised in careful handwriting and stamped with official seals. A school teacher was needed, the letter had said. A temporary assignment, modest pay, simple lodging, nothing permanent, nothing binding. It was meant to be a pause in her life, a season spent elsewhere before moving on to something more certain. She had accepted because it required no roots and no promises. She had accepted because she believed she could leave as easily as she arrived. Yet from the moment she stepped onto the platform, it was clear that her presence unsettled something. Not because she was unwelcome, but because she was unexpected in a way that could not be explained by her papers. The few townspeople nearby watched her with a quiet attentiveness that went beyond curiosity. Their gazes lingered, measuring, as if they were trying to remember where they had seen her before, or perhaps imagining where she might fit. It was not the look given to a hired worker. It was the look reserved for a possibility. She walked slowly down the single main street, past the general store with its dim windows, and the livery stable marked by old hoofprints frozen into the ground. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine sap. Somewhere a door closed softly. Somewhere else a bell rang once and then fell silent. With each step, the sense of error deepened. The town did not feel prepared for a teacher, for lessons and schedules and orderly progress. It felt as though it had been holding its breath for something else entirely.
The letter that had brought her here rested in her coat pocket, folded and unfolded so many times that its creases were soft. She had read it often during the journey, memorizing its assurances. But now, surrounded by the quiet weight of the place, the words seemed insufficient. They explained her reason for coming, but not the reason she felt suddenly exposed, as though she had arrived without the protection of certainty. At the edge of town, the land opened into fields edged by forest, their dark lines standing firm against the pale sky. Beyond them rose the hills, slow and unyielding, shaped by years of weather and patience. She paused there, looking out at the expanse, and felt the subtle pull of recognition. Not familiarity, but something closer to inevitability. The road she had taken, the losses that had led her away from other places, the choices she had believed were temporary, all seemed to converge on this moment, on this stretch of cold ground where her breath fogged the air. As she continued on, her steps leaving shallow marks in the thin snow, the feeling grew stronger that she had not simply answered an advertisement. She had followed a path laid quietly behind her, marked not by intention, but by what had been taken away. Every loss she had endured, every place she had left without looking back, had guided her here as surely as the rails that ended at the station. The address may have been unclear, the timing imperfect,
but the destination felt precise. By the time she reached the modest boarding house at the edge of town, the sky had darkened and the cold had deepened. She set her suitcase down and looked once more toward the hills, toward the trees that stood like witnesses. The letter had arrived too late, and yet she had come. Whatever mistake had carried her this far did not feel like one that could be undone. The ranch stood apart from everything else, set back from the narrow road as if it had chosen distance over convenience. The land around it was wide and spare, broken only by low fencing and the dark line of trees at its far edge. Snow gathered unevenly across the fields, shaped by the wind into shallow drifts that revealed more earth than white. Nothing about the place invited passing travelers. It existed to be reached only by those who already knew where they were going. The house itself was solid, built with care and patience, its walls thick enough to hold against long winters. The roof bore the marks of many seasons, patched and reinforced where storms had tested it. Inside, the rooms were clean and orderly, but the air carried a hollowness that no amount of tending could erase. It was the kind of emptiness left behind when a presence had once filled every corner and then vanished. The woman who had lived there was gone, and though her name was never spoken aloud, it lingered in the arrangement of furniture, in the careful preservation of small habits that no longer served a purpose. The man who owned the ranch moved through the space with quiet efficiency. Every action had been refined down to necessity. He wasted no movement, no breath, no thought on what could not be changed. His hands were roughened by work and cold, his posture shaped by years of lifting and mending. There was no hesitation in him, only a steady forward motion that kept life manageable by keeping it small. Words, when used, were few, and silence had become his most reliable companion. The boy remained close to the house, watching more than participating. He was old enough to understand what had been lost, though no one could say when he had decided that speaking no longer served him. His silence was not fragile, nor was it fearful. It was deliberate, a closed door that he guarded without strain. He communicated through glances and gestures, through stillness and sudden movement, his world shaped by observation rather than expression. In the absence of sound, he had learned to listen in other ways. The weather shifted as the day wore on, the sky lowering and darkening until the distance between earth and cloud seemed to collapse. Snow began to fall with a persistence that erased the horizon. The road back to town disappeared first, then the fences, then the landmarks that marked direction. When the woman reached the ranch, the storm had already made retreat impractical. The decision for her to stay the night was made not by invitation, but by necessity, accepted without ceremony. Inside, the warmth of the house was steady but restrained. A fire burned low, kept that way by habit rather than comfort. The woman set her things down carefully, aware of the quiet she had entered. She moved as one does in a place that does not belong to them, attentive to every sound. As evening settled in, the house revealed its rhythms. Tools were placed where they would be found again. Dishes were cleaned immediately after use. Nothing lingered longer than it had to. The boy watched from the edge of the room, his gaze steady and unreadable. The woman felt the weight of being seen without being questioned, a sensation both unsettling and strangely gentle. Night fell early, pressing against the windows with wind and snow. The storm isolated the house completely, wrapping it in a silence deeper than the one it usually held. In that isolation, the woman became aware of how long it had been since the house had known the presence of someone who stayed by choice. Not a visitor passing through, not a necessity imposed by circumstance, but a person who remained without obligation. She lay awake for a time, listening to the sounds of the structure settling, to the distant movement of the animals in their shelter. The house did not resist her presence, but it did not welcome it either.
It simply endured, as it had learned to do. And yet, beneath that endurance, something shifted almost imperceptibly. The stillness, so long unbroken, now held a pause within it, as if waiting to see whether this intrusion would fade by morning or leave a mark.
The schoolhouse stood at the far end of town, smaller than she had expected, its windows clouded by cold and neglect. When she unlocked the door for the first time, the sound echoed too loudly in the empty room. The desks were arranged neatly, their surfaces scarred by years of use, but there were no signs of recent occupation. A few names had been carved into the wood long ago, softened by time and dust. It became clear within days that the children she had been promised were scattered across distant ranches or already working beside their families. Attendance was uncertain, and with it the future of her contract. The purpose that had brought her here thinned, stretched out over too many silent hours. With little to anchor her days, she returned often to the ranch, not out of obligation, but from a quiet need to be useful. She took on small tasks at first, simple things that did not require permission. She cleaned, sorted, mended what had been set aside for later. The work filled the spaces between thought and doubt, giving her hands a reason to move. In doing so, she became part of the rhythm of the house, fitting herself into its routines without trying to alter them. The boy watched her closely. He followed her movements with a careful attention, his presence always just at the edge of her awareness. She noticed that words passed over him without effect, but actions held his focus. When she repeated a task patiently, he stayed near. When she moved slowly, allowing space for him to approach, he did. His responses were subtle but consistent, guided not by instruction but by example. She adjusted to him instinctively, learning that her voice mattered less than her steadiness. She began to include him in her work, not as a lesson, but as an invitation. He mirrored her motions, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising precision. There was no correction, no insistence, only time given freely. In that shared silence, something shifted. The boy's guarded stillness softened, replaced by moments of quiet engagement. He did not speak, but he remained, and that was enough.
The man observed these changes from a distance. He said nothing and did nothing to interrupt the developing pattern. His attention was steady but restrained, shaped by caution rather than indifference. He had learned the cost of attachment and measured every new connection against what it might take away. Yet even he could not ignore the subtle transformation of the house. The air seemed less heavy, the silence less final. Small signs of life returned, not in noise, but in movement and light. Evenings grew longer, and the house filled with a different kind of warmth. The fire was allowed to burn a little higher. Tools were left out a moment longer before being put away. The boy began to sit closer, no longer retreating at the slightest shift. The woman felt the change without naming it. She knew only that the work felt less like filling time and more like belonging. The connection formed quietly, without declaration or acknowledgement. It existed in the shared spaces between tasks, in the unspoken understanding that grew with each day. To an outside observer, little would have appeared different. Yet beneath the surface, a bond had already taken shape, fragile but real. It held without being tested, waiting for the moment when its presence could no longer be ignored.
The man arrived without announcement, his presence carried into town by a wagon that bore the marks of long travel and impatience. He brought with him papers carefully folded and kept dry, their edges stiff with importance. His connection to the place was not rooted in memory, but in claim, drawn from a past that had never fully released its hold. He was related to the woman who had died, and that single fact gave him a confidence that did not belong to him. His arrival unsettled the careful balance the town had maintained. He moved through the streets with purpose, asking questions that did not invite refusal. The words he used were orderly and rehearsed, shaped by institutions rather than experience. He spoke of responsibility, of arrangements made elsewhere, of futures defined by certainty and structure. To him, the ranch was insufficient, and the life it held was incomplete. The boy, in his view, belonged to something better, something recognized and sanctioned. At the ranch, the weight of his intent settled heavily. The man who lived there listened without visible reaction, his expression unchanged. Yet the stillness that usually surrounded him tightened, becoming rigid rather than calm. The threat was not loud, but it was precise. It reached beyond the present, touching on fears that had never been spoken. The idea of losing what remained of his family pressed in from all sides, forcing him to confront the limits of the life he had built. The woman sensed the shift immediately. The house, which had grown subtly warmer, now felt strained, as if holding itself together through effort alone. She understood her position with sudden clarity. She was not part of any agreement, not named in any document. Her presence, once unnoticed, now felt dangerously visible. What had been forming quietly could be undone just as easily. She moved through the house with care, aware of how easily she could be removed from its story. Each object she touched seemed to remind her of how temporary her place was. The work she had taken on, the routines she had joined, all existed outside of obligation. She realized that she had come to mean something, not because she was needed, but because she had stayed. And now, staying felt like a risk she was not entitled to take. The boy remained close, watching the adults with a concentration sharpened by uncertainty. His silence deepened, becoming watchful rather than withdrawn. He sensed the instability without understanding its source. The connection he had formed was fragile, easily disrupted by forces he could not name. The woman felt this and knew that her continued presence might complicate decisions that were already heavy with consequence.
As the day wore on, her resolve took shape quietly. She began to prepare for departure, not in haste, but with resignation. She gathered her things methodically, folding and placing them with care, as if trying to erase any trace of her having been there. Each movement carried the weight of restraint, the deliberate avoidance of attachment. Leaving seemed like the only way to preserve what little stability remained. The house felt larger as her belongings diminished, its spaces expanding back into silence. The warmth that had settled there retreated, replaced by a familiar emptiness. She did not announce her intention. There was no need. The distance was already growing, stretching between what had been and what could no longer be claimed. By the time the light began to fade, the sense of loss was unmistakable. The decision, once made, carried its own momentum. If she left now, the ranch would return to what it had been before her arrival. The silence would close in again, complete and unchallenged. And though no one had spoken the truth aloud, it was clear that this time, the emptiness would not wait for another chance to be filled. After her departure, the house fell into a silence that felt heavier than before. It was not the familiar quiet shaped by routine and endurance, but something denser, weighted by absence. The boy withdrew almost immediately. He stopped coming to the table and left his food untouched. He remained in his room, the door closed, the space beyond it sealed off, as if the world outside had lost its claim on him. There were no outward signs of illness, no fever or weakness, yet something essential had retreated inward. The man noticed the change slowly at first, mistaking it for the child's usual reserve. But days passed, and the stillness grew more pronounced. The boy's movements became minimal,
his presence reduced to the faintest indications of life within the house. The silence that followed him was not protective this time. It was deliberate, an act of refusal. The loss he had experienced once before was repeating itself, and he responded with the only defense he knew. In the absence of words, the boy communicated through action. He left small signs behind, barely noticeable at first.
The man watched these signs accumulate, each one pressing against the boundaries he had drawn around his life. He had believed that caution would protect what remained, that restraint would prevent further loss. Instead, it had narrowed his world until there was no room left for anything that mattered. The realization came without drama, settling into him with the certainty of something long denied. Everything he had built in the name of safety had become a kind of confinement. He sat with the weight of that understanding, allowing it to reshape his view of the past. The patterns were unmistakable. Each time he had pulled back, something essential had slipped away. Each time he had chosen silence, the space around him had grown emptier. The boy's quiet withdrawal now reflected that same instinct, learned too early and too well. The recognition carried with it a sense of responsibility he could no longer avoid. The pressure from outside still existed, but it no longer held the same authority. The threat of loss, once paralyzing, became a measure of what was at stake, rather than what must be surrendered. He understood that the risk he feared had already been realized in another form. Doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was a choice with consequences, as real as any action.
The decision did not come suddenly. It unfolded through a series of small acknowledgments, each one stripping away a layer of hesitation. He accepted the cost of standing against expectations, against the comfort of familiar patterns. He accepted that holding on meant exposing himself to pain, that choosing differently might still end in loss. But he also saw, with growing clarity, that the alternative led only to the same emptiness he already knew. As night fell, the house remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It no longer pressed inward, it waited. The man moved through the rooms with a new sense of direction, not toward an immediate solution, but toward a commitment he had avoided for too long. The path ahead was not defined by urgency or pursuit. It was shaped by resolve, by an inner shift that had finally taken place. The boy remained in his room, still and watchful, unaware of the decision forming beyond his door. Yet the change had already begun. The choice had been made, not in words or promises, but in the steady acceptance of what could no longer be denied. The movement toward what would come next was quiet, deliberate, and irreversible.
Winter settled in at the edge of the season, not with force, but with intention. The first snow arrived quietly, laying itself over the land as if testing whether it would be allowed to stay. It softened the hard lines of the fields and muted the distance between sky and ground. Everything slowed beneath it. Time itself seemed willing to wait. She returned along the same road she had taken away, but the journey felt different now. There was no hesitation in her steps, no sense of retreat. She had not been summoned, had not been asked to reconsider. What drew her back could not be written or spoken. It existed in the certainty that something unfinished was still holding space for her. The cold followed her, but it did not resist her. It simply moved aside.
The ranch emerged from the pale landscape, unchanged and yet unmistakably alive. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady whine, dark against the sky. Fresh tracks marked the snow near the house, purposeful and close together. The place no longer appeared withdrawn. It stood present, grounded, waiting without expectation. She crossed the yard slowly, aware of the quiet that surrounded her. Snow pressed gently beneath her boots, leaving marks that did not feel temporary. When she reached the door, the warmth inside met her without ceremony.
It was familiar, not because it had always been hers, but because it had made room. The boy saw her before anything else could shift. He stepped forward without pause, moving through the open space with a certainty that had not been there before. His hand found hers easily, openly, and he held on as if the gesture itself confirmed what he already knew. There was no searching in him now, no withdrawal. The choice was simple, and it was his.
She felt the weight of that moment settle gently between them. It did not demand response. It only asked to be accepted. She stayed still, allowing the connection to exist without explanation, understanding that this was not a return to what had been lost, but the beginning of something that had never existed before.
The man stood nearby, watching with a quiet steadiness. He did not intervene or declare anything aloud. His decision had already been made, in the way he remained where he was, in the way he did not turn away. He had learned that presence did not require defense, only consistency. What mattered now was not what could be taken, but what could be chosen again and again. Days passed, marked by small, deliberate actions. Work resumed with a shared rhythm. Meals were prepared and eaten together, not as an event, but as part of the day's natural order. Care appeared in repetition rather than promise. Nothing was rushed. Nothing needed to be named.
Outside, winter deepened. Snow erased old paths and replaced them with new ones, pressed close together near the house. At night, the windows glowed softly against the dark, steady and visible from far across the fields. Inside, 3 figures moved within that light, connected not by law or agreement, but by a shared decision to stay. In the place where no one had planned to remain, a future took hold. It did not announce itself or ask to be believed. It simply endured. If stories like this speak to you, stories that move slowly and find family through silence and choice, consider subscribing to Dust and Devotion Tales, leaving a like and turning on notifications. Here, we tell stories where love does not arrive loudly, but it remains.